Christ is risen. Today's the 6th Sunday of Pascha. All the way through Pascha, one of the themes is the light of Christ. Twice in the Gospels, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Once in John 8:12 and once in John 9, verse 5. So light is a very important theme in Byzantine theology. And today, our Gospel reading concentrates on the man who was born blind and his healing. So the story goes that Jesus met this man. He was born blind. He applied a mixture of clay and spittle to his eyes and sent him to wash in the pool of Siloam. We heard at Matins this morning that 3 of the early church fathers tell us that Jesus actually created the eyeball and put it in. He is the creator of the world. He created the eyeball and he put it into this man's eyes, the eye socket. Having received his sight, he was immediately attacked by the Pharisees, and who said that Jesus was a sinner because he healed on the Sabbath. And the man protested that a sinner can't heal. That's ridiculous. So they excommunicated him from the temple. Jesus found him. That's an interesting sort of little thing there we could develop. Jesus found him. He didn't find Jesus. And often we think we found Jesus, but actually he's found us. And Jesus said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? And the blind man answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. Jesus spoke similar words to the woman, the Samaritan woman, actually. And then he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. So this gospel story illustrates the words of Isaiah from chapter 35, where he said, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened. It also fulfills what Jesus himself said, the Spirit of the Lord has sent me to preach recovery of sight to the blind. It's clear that physical blindness is what Jesus is dealing with in this gospel story, but it symbolizes spiritual blindness and changing into spiritual seeing. So the man born blind didn't know who Jesus was, and in the end, he's worshipping Jesus. That's the journey for many people. They don't even know who Jesus is, but in the end, God touches their lives and they worship him. We get some commentary on this from the church itself, from the Pentecostarian, talking about this Sunday. We read these words. O Christ God, Son of righteousness, by your touch you enlightened all. Give sight now to our spiritual eyes and show us to be sons of the day. Or another translation says, children of the light. Great is your ineffable goodness towards us, O lover of man. Glory to you. And the Kentuckian from the Pentecostarian, I come to you, O Christ, blind from birth in my spiritual eyes, and call to you in repentance. You are the most radiant light of those in darkness. So there we have the understanding. Jesus was dealing with physical blindness in this story, but actually it's a symbol of spiritual blindness, and then moving to where we can actually see Jesus and worship him. St. John Chrysostom tells us that this spiritual blindness can only be healed by faith in Jesus. That is the only way to find this healing. How does this actually work in practice? Well, it works in many different ways. It's different for all of us, actually. All we know is we go from spiritual blindness to seeing Jesus and wanting to worship him. For example, Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, some of you may have heard of him, a Russian metropolitan, ended up in London. He died in London. But in his early life, he was the son of a diplomat in Iran at the time when the Russian Empire collapsed, or the Tsar was deposed. And so they had to move to France. And in France, he was very against the Christian church, very against the Christian faith, in fact. And one day, one of his friends heard a priest who was visiting Paris, and he came and spoke to Metropolitan Bloom and told him what he'd heard. And Metropolitan Bloom was furious. He said, "This is absolute rubbish. Why are you listening to this person?" And he decided to go home, open his Bible, and read from the Gospels so that he could prove to his friend that what the priest was saying was absolute rubbish. And he tells us in his biography, he says, while he was reading, he suddenly became aware of the presence of Christ. And from then on, he became a monk, then he became a priest, then he became a bishop, and he served his last years in a church in London. He was very well known in England. He actually made the Times one Easter because there was a report they had to call the police because there were 4 times as many people trying to get into his church as there was room for it. It was a complete opposite problem to most churches in England, which are nearly empty. So God opened his eyes and he could see that Jesus really was who he claimed to be, God. Another story to show you how completely different these experiences are is John Newton. He's a well-known Western Christian. You'll all know some of his music, his writing. How many of you have heard of Amazing Grace? He wrote this wonderful song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. He was a naval man. He went to sea quite early in his life, and he was sailing up and down the coast of Africa collecting slaves for the slave market. And he was not a very nice person at all. And then he ended up one day in his ship in a storm, 12 hours of fierce storm. Some of the sailors got washed overboard. They all feared for their lives. He was actually lashed to the steering wheel on the boat, otherwise he would have been washed off as well. So he was tied to the steering wheel so he didn't get washed off. And in his need, he called out, "Lord, have mercy on us." When he got back, he never went back to that trade. He became a Christian. He studied Hebrew, he studied Greek, he became a minister of the church. He wrote the hymn, Amazing Grace. Completely different to what Anthony Bloom experienced. But it was the same experience as the blind man. And we still sing that hymn today. And the last verse goes like this: Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saves a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. That's the last line of that hymn. So you can see this is what we're talking about today. So that was the introduction. I now have an outline with 4 points. And you need to remember this because it's very difficult to remember. First point is testimony. Second point is testimony. Third point is testimony. And the fourth point is testimony. All right. There'll be a test afterwards on this one. In 1 Peter 3:15, we have a very important verse in the scriptures. And it says this. Verse 15. Sanctify the Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. In other words, if somebody comes along and says, "Why are you a Christian? Why are you going to church? Why are you Orthodox?" What are you going to say? Do you know what are you going to say? It's very important that we are able to give people an answer to their questions. And we see today, but today it's quite scary, isn't it? We're happy to talk about our faith in church, but out there in the world, maybe I'll keep my head down and I won't open my mouth about these things. Well, let's have a look at the readings for the day. First one, testimony. First point, remember that? but it's testimony of Jesus. Jesus mixed clay and spittle, and he told the blind man, to go and wash his hands in the pool of Siloam. And he was healed. Spitting, clay making, and washing were strictly forbidden on the Sabbath by the Jews. You couldn't do any of that. By breaking these laws, Jesus made the Pharisees angry, but he was also giving testimony to who he was. He was saying that he was equal to God the Father, who alone, according to Jewish tradition, works on the Sabbath day. So even though Jesus knew people were against him and were going to cause trouble, he gave his testimony to who he was. I am God. Second one. Whoops, I've turned over 2 pages. Second one, the testimony of the blind man. He knew he was in trouble. You could probably tell by the look on the Pharisees' faces and so on, after he was healed. And they attacked him. And despite the risks and the dangers, he continued to tell them that Jesus had healed him. He knew there would be consequences, but he kept telling him, it was Jesus who healed me. And even when they said, well, he's a sinner, he can't be here, he said, it doesn't make sense. How can a man who's a sinner heal me? It's Jesus who healed me. That was his testimony. So the testimony of the blind man, second point, is that he is healed. And then in the epistle today is not the normal epistle we have on this Sunday of the Blind Man Sunday. It's actually the epistle for St. Constantine and St. Helen. But it fits in perfectly with what I'm saying today. Because it's St. Paul's. It's the testimony of St. Paul, the apostle. And what a testimony. He was a man who was totally against Christianity. Totally against Christianity. A bit like Metropolitan Anthony Balloon when he started. And he was ferocious in his attacks against them. They think he was there when St. Stephen, the first martyr, was martyred. And he was on his way to Damascus to persecute the church even more, when suddenly there's a great light from heaven which blinds him and knocks him off his horse. And a voice says to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he says, Lord, who are you? Who are you? He says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And Paul's life is turned around from that point. And he then becomes very, very enthusiastic about the Christian faith. And he's preaching about the gospel everywhere he goes. And in fact, Jesus says to him, I am sending you to open their eyes. This is what Paul's commission was. I am sending you to open their eyes. So this is the Gentiles, that's us, so that they may turn from darkness to light. This is Jesus' commission. It's light again. Anyway, Paul gets into trouble because he's preaching the gospel. It's not the first time we think we get into trouble if we preach the gospel. It's been happening right from the start. We have to get used to it, unfortunately. We're in a hostile world. But by looking at the examples of these people, it gives us courage to be bold and to share our testimonies. So anyway, he is arrested. He goes back to Jerusalem. He's arrested in the temple on false charges. He's fearing for his life, actually, with the Jews. So he happens to be a Roman citizen. So he asks to have Roman justice. So he's sent to Caesarea, where he appears before one judge and then another judge, and then he ends up in front of King Agrippa. And it's in front of King Agrippa that he gives his testimony. And in the end, he appeals to Caesar, and he's sent to Rome, and there he dies there. But you can see here, even though there's a lot of fear, he's still gives his testimony and tells King Agrippa exactly what happened to him and how Jesus changed his life. And Agrippa was very impressed. He said, Paul, I feel like you're trying to make me a Christian, which he was, of course. And so the first point was testimony of Jesus. Second point was testimony of the blind man. Third point was testimony of St. Paul. The fourth point, this is where the rubber hits the road. The fourth point is the testimony of us to Australia. It includes two parts. One is works. Jesus, he made the eyeball. He actually worked. He showed people his power. And one part of our testimony is the way we live, the way we do things. But the second part is speaking out as well, like the blind man and like St. Paul. There's many people in our Western world, especially in Australia. 100 years ago, 98% of Australians were Christians. Now it's below 50. So there's a lot of people out there waiting to have their eyes opened. And you know what? They may never have their eyes opened if they don't hear our testimony. This is the reality. Here's a little bit of my testimony. If somebody hadn't invited me to a particular meeting, which I didn't even know was on, I might never have found the faith. Maybe I would have in another way, but I accepted that meeting. I thought the person asking me was going to burst into tears, and I felt sorry for him, so I went. And when I went to this meeting, my heart was warmed. And it was the beginning of a journey for me to here today. So people need to hear our testimonies. And what I'm going to do a one-off thing. I haven't done this before. I don't know how it's going to work. But it's all very well me telling you, you've got to be able to tell your testimony. How do you do that? So what I'm going to do on Thursday night this week at 8 o'clock, we're going to have a Zoom workshop where I will give you some instructions, some guidance as to how you can make your testimony so that when somebody asks you, why do you go to church? Why are you a Christian? Why do you love Jesus? You'll be able to give them an answer, even when it's difficult. It's very interesting that this passage I read to you at the beginning about 1 Peter 3:15. The heading in the Orthodox Study Bible is entitled Suffering for Righteousness. That's the heading of this little passage. And who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. So St. Peter there is talking to people who are afraid and saying, you've got to be ready, and when the time comes, you've got to do it, even if it's risky. Like the person who asked me to go to that meeting, I could tell he was nervous, very nervous. I thought he was going to burst into tears, but he did it. I thank God for that young man to this day. And you and I might be like that to someone else somewhere. You might be surprised how many people out there would love to know Jesus and have a relationship with him and find meaning in life, purpose in life, experience his love, and have that for the rest of their lives and on into eternity. All right, so we'll send out an email and we'll give you the details as how you can join in that workshop on Thursday night, and we'll see whether we can work together on being a stronger light to Australia. Amen. Christ is risen. Thank you.